The upcoming anniversary on the 28th of October, Friday the 28th of October, is the 100th anniversary of the referendum. Plebiscite is the big word that's in the community at the moment in regards to gay marriage or equal marriage. 100 years ago we had a referendum to determine whether or not to conscript young Australian men to send them over to fight in wars in Europe. And the Trades Hall Council played a prominent role in the campaign against conscription, and so with this 100th anniversary coming up, a range of activities will be happening at Trades Hall and to highlight the role Trades Hall has played in that conscription debate. Well, 100 years ago, as part of our campaign, we bedecked the building in anti-war and anti-conscription banners, and for this centenary what we've done is reproduce some of the banners here. And this one, for example, says the figure in the middle symbolises liberty, holding aloft her red bandana. "I am the hope of the world, enslave me not." It was about much the same as the early trade union movement when we started in Victoria with the fight for the 8-hour day. It was to have the freedom to enjoy ourselves, the freedom to live with dignity in a civilised society, which conscription was obviously opposed to. And around here, towards this end of the building, we've got a particular banner that represents the Australian soldier who was already overseas. We understood that some workers, some people, thought it was important to go and fight the war. And for those people who are overseas, we're saying, you left Australia as free men, and let's stay as free men. You have someone who votes to enlists to go overseas, and while they're away fighting, often in the trenches without even knowing what was going on back home, they find out that they're now enslaved men because they've been conscripted when they've had no idea what was going on. So they're saying, we left Australia free men, keep us free. And the next banner basically saying that if you really want to support the Australians in the field of battle, vote no, but send wheat. The best way Australia was seen to be able to contribute to the war effort was by sending wheat, sending food basically to the soldiers. And so it wasn't totally anti-war, it was against conscription. Yes, well, as you can see here, the first referendum lost by about 10%, and it was very, very clear that the Australian people didn't want conscription. Now, the Prime Minister at the time, Billy Hughes, reckoned that was an act of treachery, etc., and decided to hold a second referendum the next year and actually change some of the laws and put the government on a major public relations campaign with stump tours, town hall meetings, etc., to promote the yes case for the vote. We obviously stepped up our no campaign, and they lost by, as you can see there, an even greater margin. On this side of the hall is a particularly poignant mural, because what it represents is not just the Australians who voted against conscription while they were back home, because you could see a whole lot of reasons why that would be the natural case, but also for the second referendum they made it mandatory for all fighting service people in the field who were already deployed to vote in the referendum. Now, they did this in the hope that the fighting men would vote for conscription in the belief that they'd be replaced by fresh troops from Australia. The fighting men in the First World War, and women, there were a few women there as well, voted against conscription because they didn't want their friends and family to suffer the same torment and degradation that they had unfortunately volunteered for. So the fact that the actual soldiers are also opposed to conscription is very telling, because quite often organisations like Trades Hall that work against war and against conscription are told that it's easy for us to do. And, we have this image of peaceniks, etc. But the truth is, throughout history, the people who have always been most opposed to war have been the people who have experienced fighting it. Okay, this is just a selection of some of the pictures and some of the cartoons for the day. We have, you know, for example, a picture here of Billy Hughes talking to the figure of England, John Bull, saying that's the last man, now for the last shilling, you know, saying that we're just giving everything to the British war effort. This is at a time as well, the Catholic Church were big in the anti-conscription campaign as well, because it can't be seen outside of the context of the Easter Uprising in 1916 and the idea of sending Catholic men to fight for the Protestant king who was subjecting our people in Ireland. You can't leave that out of the equation. And you have here the case for and against conscription. Women's Anti-Conscription League, women played a huge role in the anti-conscription movement of the First World War. A huge role. The women's committees, it's where Mother's Day basically started. We're not going to send our sons off to be fighters. You know, Billy's foreign mash, the old love. So it was for that I was forsaken. It was like Billy Hughes was originally a Labor leader, and he's given up his left-wing ideology and everything so that he can go out with rule Britannia, basically. Welcome home, it says here, to the cause of anti-conscription, pointing out that Billy Hughes once said, under no circumstances would I agree to send men to fight in the war against their will. So it's just a whole lot of propaganda of the time that we just thought a selection that we put here. It was important too that while Trades Hall took a very, very principled stand against conscription, as I say, the Catholic Church took a principled stand, but it was also the point that, you know, the Catholic-Protestant divide. There was also a small dark side, I guess, to the anti-conscription campaign, where people were afraid to send all our young Australian men overseas. This is a time of the White Australia policy was in full force. There was also the fear that by sending all our young men overseas, there'll be a shortage of labour and we bring in coloured labour to fill people's jobs. That actually happened when, well, as a Maltese, for example, Malta was the hospital island for the Gallipoli evacuees. Now, the Gallipoli evacuees made friends with the Maltese and invited them to Australia, and a boatload of carpenters came here. The dark side of the workers' movement actually said this was proof that Billy Hughes was just sending white workers overseas to die so that coloured labourers like us Maltese could take their jobs. And he actually stopped the boat landing in Australia and sent it off to Circle, New Caledonia, in some airy prescience of John Howard's Pacific solution. And only after the referendum allowed the boat to come into Sydney Harbour, but then, even then, kept it docked in Sydney Harbour and didn't let anybody on or off the ship. Not because they didn't want us Maltese working here, but because Billy Hughes didn't want to give ammunition to the fact that coloured labour was coming over here. Now, while we're passing these doors, one important thing to point out is that at this time, this part of the Trades Hall was still being built. This was the 1916 part of it, which is why the murals are in this part of the hall. Prime Minister Hughes was personally very much invested in the idea of conscription because he went over to England and promised that he would provide so many thousand Australian soldiers. As Trades Hall was one of the major organisations opposing conscription, the police came through to, confiscate our anti-conscription material. They came to the doors, and the secretary at the time held them back from the doors, and they went in through the back door, taken around there by the previous caretaker. I'm ashamed to say, my predecessor, who was more concerned with the fabric of the doors and the fabric of the politics of the place, and led the police into a raid through the back doors of Trades Hall. So at this point came, the Secretary of Trades Hall, Holloway, opposing the police and telling them that they should not enter. But unfortunately, as I say, they went round the back. but that just highlights how important the conscription debate was in the fabric of Australian society. Well, unfortunately, the war didn't end with the referendum in 1917. Australia's been involved in wars pretty constantly since that time. At the moment, of course, one of the ways that we are involved in war is through our hosting of US bases in places like Codgerima, Northwest Cape, and of course at Pine Gap. Now, Pine Gap, which is a US military command control computer surveillance base just outside of Alice Springs, is a linchpin of our involvement with the US military, and is used to target and provide surveillance for drones and American and coalition forces in places like Yemen, Iraq, and as well as in places like Palestine. So to mark the 50th anniversary of Pine Gap's existence, we went up there with a couple of hundred people and blockaded Pine Gap last week, and just to help put the role of US bases in Australia on the map.
Any future demonstrations you got planned?
Yeah, well, there's always something going on, and of course this is without my trades hall hat on. We're going to set up a major protest during the Arms Fair, which takes place 3 days before the air show on the same location at Avalon Airport. Melburnians would know the Avalon Air Show, where planes do loop-de-loops and there's all kinds of hijinks, and they market it as a family fun day. What a lot of people don't know is that while the air show starts on Friday night, for the Tuesday and Wednesday before that, it is a closed arms exhibition that they're building as one of the largest arms trade fairs in the region. So a whole lot of peace activists are going to go and attempt to shut it down, basically.